I'm a registered hospice nurse, or at least I was. For 18 years, I worked in palliative and end-of-life care at the Serenity Bridge Hospice Center, a facility affiliated with St. Jude's Regional Medical Center in Portland. During my career, I've sat with over 1,000 patients in their final days, their final hours, their final moments. I've administered morphine drips, held hands, sung forgotten lullabies, and listened to more deathbed confessions than a priest. I thought I understood death. I've seen the peaceful passings, the agitated transitions, the ones filled with regret and the ones filled with acceptance, and I believed I knew the boundaries of that final human experience. I thought it was a book I had read 1,000 times over, with familiar chapters and a predictable end. But about a year ago, one patient, one single case, didn't just add a new chapter to that book. It tore the whole thing to shreds and set the pages on fire. What happened in that room was so profoundly impossible, so utterly disturbing in its implications, that I tendered my resignation 2 weeks later and have not set foot in a medical facility since. This case haunts me, it keeps me awake at night, and it fundamentally changed me forever. What I'm about to tell you will challenge everything you think you know about where life ends and where something else begins. It sounds impossible, but I swear on my life, and on the career I lost, that every word is true. Serenity Bridge wasn't a hospital. That's the first thing you need to understand. We went to great lengths to make it feel like anything but. It was designed to be the last, best home for people who had no more medical roads left to travel. Tucked away in a quiet, wooded corner of the St. Jude's campus, it was a low, sprawling building of cedar and glass, with private rooms that each had a large picture window and a small patio overlooking a meticulously kept garden of rhododendrons and Japanese maples. The philosophy was simple. Death is not a medical failure, but a natural process. Our job wasn't to fight it, but to ease its passage. We were experts in comfort, in dignity, in the art of letting go. My shifts were long, 12 hours, usually nights. I preferred it. The nights in a hospice are a world unto themselves. The administrative hustle of the day fades. The families have mostly gone home, and a thick, heavy quiet settles over the halls. It's a sacred quiet, punctuated only by the soft whir of an oxygen concentrator, the gentle beep of a PCA pump, or the hushed whispers of the night staff. In that quiet, you can really listen. You learn to read the rhythm of a patient's breathing, to know by the subtle shift in their posture if their pain is managed, to feel the emotional temperature of a room the moment you walk in. For 18 years, this was my world. Predictable, somber, meaningful. I was good at my job. I was calm, I was compassionate, and I was unflappable. I had seen everything, or so I thought. The inciting incident, as they say in stories, wasn't a dramatic ambulance arrival or a frantic call. It was a simple chart appearing in our system for a new admission. The name was Alistair Finch. The diagnosis was what first caught my eye. It wasn't the usual suspects: late-stage cancer, heart failure, advanced COPD. It was listed as a rapidly progressive, unclassifiable neurodegenerative disorder. Age: 58. That was young for us. Most of our residents were in their 70s, 80s, or 90s. The notes from his neurologist at St. Jude's were clinical, detached, and utterly baffled. They described a condition that had appeared only 6 months prior, starting with minor motor control issues and escalating to a near-total paralysis. He was almost completely immobile, save for slight movements of his head and his eyes. But his cognitive function, the report stated, remained hyperlucid. An unusual term, not just lucid but hyperlucid. Prognosis: less than a month. He was being transferred to us for comfort care as his bodily systems began the final shutdown cascade. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, just as I was coming on for my night shift. I got the handover report from the day nurse, a wonderful woman named Carol. "He's in room 8, she said, flipping through her notes. Alistair Finch, single, no known family. A lawyer from a downtown firm is his power of attorney. He's different, Sarah." Carol was, like me, a veteran. Took a lot to make her raise an eyebrow. "How so?" I asked, pulling my stethoscope from my locker. "He's just still," she said, searching for the right word. I mean, I know he's paralyzed, but it's more than that. It's a kind of calm I've never seen. He watches everything, and he speaks like he's dictating a legal brief. Very precise. No fear, no sadness, not even any anger. It's just acceptance. But it doesn't feel like peace. It feels like observation. That was my first clue that something was unusual. In my experience, every patient, no matter how prepared, carries a storm of emotions inside them. Fear, grief, denial, rage, regret. It's the human response to the abyss. Even the most stoic betray it in the tremor of a hand or the flicker of an eye. To have none of that, to have what Carol described as a kind of detached observation, was concerning. It suggested a profound psychological break, a disassociation so complete that it mimicked peace. I went to his room, knocking softly before entering. "Mr. Finch? My name is Sarah. I'll be your nurse this evening." The room was standard Serenity Bridge. Soft lighting, a comfortable chair for visitors that wasn't being used, and the big window looking out at the twilight descending on the garden. He was propped up in the bed, his head supported by pillows. He was a man who had probably been handsome, with sharp features and intelligent gray eyes. Those eyes, clear and startlingly bright, swiveled to meet mine. They were the only part of him that seemed truly alive, and they were unervingly focused. "Good evening, Sarah," he said. His voice was a low, steady monotone, produced with some effort but perfectly clear. "You have been a registered nurse for 18 years, 4 months, and 6 days. You prefer the night shift because you believe it offers a more authentic connection to the transition process. Your last performance review noted your exceptional skill in pain management but also a tendency towards becoming, and I quote, overly invested in patient narratives. It is good to meet you." I froze in the doorway. My hand was still on the handle. Every single thing he had said was true, down to the detail about my performance review, a private conversation I'd had with my manager, Brenda, less than a month ago. A cold dread, completely alien to me in this professional setting, washed over my skin. I forced a professional smile, my mind racing through rational explanations. Had he overheard staff talking? Unlikely. Had he somehow accessed my personnel file? Impossible. "Well," I said, my voice a little tighter than I wanted, "you seem to have done your homework." I walked over to the bed, busying myself with checking his 4-line, which was set for a slow saline drip to keep the vein open. My hands felt clumsy. "How are you feeling, Mr. Finch? Is your pain under control?" His eyes followed my every movement. "The term pain is a subjective interpretation of nociceptive signals," he replied, his voice devoid of any emotion. "My signal processing is degrading, but the core experience is manageable. The current dosage of hydromorphone is adequate. However, at approximately 2:17 a.m., the C-clamp on this 4-stand will fail due to metal fatigue, causing the saline bag to fall. It will not detach from the line, so there is no risk of fluid loss or air embolism. It will simply be an auditory disturbance. You may wish to preemptively replace the clamp." I stared at him. Then I looked at the C-clamp holding his 4-bag. It looked perfectly fine. It was a standard piece of stainless steel equipment, one of 100 in the facility. His statement was so specific, so bizarre, that I didn't know how to respond. This wasn't the rambling of a confused patient. It was delivered as a factual, technical report. I made a non-committal noise and continued my initial assessment, taking his vitals. Blood pressure a little low, heart rate steady, respiration shallow but regular. Everything was textbook for his condition, everything except the man in the bed. As I documented the vitals in his chart at the nurse's station, I felt a growing sense of unease that went far beyond Carol's description of him being different. This was something else. This was deeply, profoundly wrong. My training, my 18 years of experience, provided me with a checklist of possible explanations. Delusions. Confabulation due to his neurological condition. Perhaps he was a brilliant man whose mind was creating intricate fictions as it fell apart. That had to be it. It was the only explanation that fit within the framework of my reality. I wrote in my notes, "Patient is alert and oriented, though exhibiting some unusual, highly detailed ideations. Will continue to monitor. It felt like a laughably inadequate summary of what had just happened. I tried to put it out of my mind, to focus on my rounds with my other 7 patients. There was Mrs. Gable in room 2, wrestling with agitation and sundowning. Mr. Chun in room 4, whose family was holding a quiet vigil. It was a normal night, but my mind kept snagging on Alistair Finch in room 8, on his unervingly calm eyes, on his impossible knowledge about my career, on his absurd, specific prediction about a piece of medical equipment. I found myself glancing at the clock on the wall. 10 p.m., 11 p.m., midnight. Each hour felt like a countdown. I told myself it was ridiculous. I was a medical professional, not a character in a ghost story. I was letting a dying man's confused ramblings get to me, but I couldn't shake it. That feeling of professional inadequacy, the sense that my vast experience was suddenly a useless map in an alien landscape, was already taking root. This was only my first night with him. It was just the beginning. The setup was complete, and the pieces were on the board for a game I didn't know the rules to. And I was already losing. The hours after midnight passed in the familiar, hushed rhythm of the hospice. I helped Maria, the night aide, turn Mrs. Gable to prevent bed sores. I checked on Mr. Chen's breathing, which was becoming more labored. I refilled water pitchers, updated charts, and did my best to immerse myself in the routine, to let the comforting cadence of my duties wash away the disquieting conversation with Mr. Finch. But his words were like a burr, stuck to the fabric of my thoughts. At around 1:30 a.m., I was at the nurse's station, reviewing medication schedules, when Maria came up to me, her young face etched with worry. "Sarah," she whispered, "that man in room 8, Mr. Finch, he's strange." Maria was a good aide. She was only in her early 20s, working her way through nursing school, but she was intuitive and deeply compassionate. "I know, Maria. His condition can cause some cognitive eccentricities," I said, trying to sound more reassuring than I felt. "What happened?" "I went in to check on him," she said, her voice low, "and he was just staring at the ceiling. I asked if he needed anything, and he said, 'No, thank you, Maria, but you should call your mother. The argument you had about your tuition payment is weighing on her more than you realize. A resolution now will prevent unnecessary distress later.'" "Sarah, how could he know that? I had a fight with my mom on the phone in my car before my shift started. I haven't told a soul." She was gripping a pen so tightly her knuckles were white. Here it was again. Another piece of impossible knowledge. This wasn't about me, something he could have maybe overheard. This was about Maria, a private, emotional detail from her life just hours before. The rational explanations were getting thinner, stretched to the point of transparency. I put a hand on Maria's arm. Neurological disorders can sometimes cause patients to say things that seem perceptive. I lied, the clinical jargon feeling hollow and false in my own mouth. It's like their brain is misfiring and they just hit on things by coincidence. "Don't let it trouble you." She nodded, but she wasn't convinced, and neither was I. The feeling of moral isolation was beginning to creep in. I was the senior nurse on duty, the one who was supposed to have the answers, to project calm and authority. But inside, I was just as unnerved as the nursing aide. I spent the next 45 minutes deliberately avoiding room 8. I told myself I was giving the patient his rest, but I knew I was avoiding him. I was afraid of what he might say next. What personal detail of my life would he pluck from the air? The thought was violating. At 2:15 a.m., I was standing at the medication cart, drawing up a dose of lorazepam for Mrs. Gable. The hallway was silent. The nurse's station was empty. Maria was on her break. It was just me and the quiet hum of the building. I glanced at the clock. 2:16 a.m. My heart began to beat a little faster. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I was a scientist, a woman of medicine, and I was getting spooked by a coincidence. At precisely 2:17 a.m., a loud, metallic clang echoed down the hall from the direction of room 8. It was followed by the heavy thud of the full 4 bag hitting the linoleum floor. I dropped the syringe onto the cart. My blood ran cold. For a moment I didn't move. I just stood there, listening to the silence that followed. He had been right. Not just about the event, but about the time. To the minute. My training kicked in, overriding the fear. I hurried down the hall and into his room. The overhead light was off, the room lit only by the soft glow from the hallway and the dim readouts on the medical stand. The 4-bag was on the floor, just as he'd predicted, still connected to the line. The metal C-clamp that had held it was dangling from the pole, a clean break visible in the metal. It had snapped. I looked from the broken clamp to Alistair Finch. His head was turned towards me, his bright, intelligent eyes watching me in the gloom. There was no surprise on his face. No, I told you so. Just that same, unnerving, placid observation. The tensile strength was compromised by a microscopic fracture sustained during manufacturing, he said, his voice a calm monotone in the quiet room. The cyclical weight stress of a full 1-liter saline bag, combined with the ambient temperature fluctuations of the room, created the precise conditions for catastrophic failure at this specific time. It is a simple matter of physics, Sarah. My mind reeled. This wasn't a lucky guess. This wasn't a delusion. This was something else. I felt a chasm open up beneath me, the solid ground of my professional knowledge giving way to a terrifying void of the unknown. I replaced the clamp with a new one from the supply closet, my hands shaking slightly. I rehung the bag and checked the drip rate. All my actions were automatic, the muscle memory of 2 decades at work, while my conscious mind struggled to process the impossibility of what was happening. I felt a surge of professional inadequacy so profound it was almost nauseating. What good was my knowledge of medicine, of the human body, when I was faced with a patient who could predict the fatigue fracture in a piece of steel? The next day, I knew I had to escalate this. This went beyond unusual ideations. I requested a meeting with my direct supervisor, Brenda, and Dr. Evans, the hospice's medical director. Brenda was a nurse of the old school. She'd been a nurse for 30 years, and she believed in protocols, paperwork, and professional distance. Dr. Evans was a kind but rigidly scientific man who saw the world through a lens of biology and chemistry. I knew it would be a tough sell. We met in Brenda's small, cluttered office. I laid it all out for them, trying to keep my voice as level and professional as possible. I told them about his comments on my personnel file. I told them what he'd said to Maria. I told them, with emphasis, about his precise prediction of the 4-clamp failure. I even brought the broken clamp with me in a biohazard bag, as if it were a piece of evidence. Brenda listened, her arms crossed, her expression hardening with every word I spoke. Dr. Evans steepled his fingers, a thoughtful but skeptical look on his face. When I finished, there was a long silence. "Sarah," Brenda said finally, her voice laced with a weary disappointment that was worse than any anger. "You are an excellent nurse, one of the best, but you've always had this tendency to get too involved. Mr. Finch has a rare and tragic neurological condition. His brain is, for lack of a better term, short-circuiting. It's not uncommon for patients with frontal lobe degradation to experience something called confabulation, where they create false memories, or to have a lack of social filter. He's probably a very intelligent man, and his dying brain is just throwing out random, complex sentences. Some of them, by pure chance, are going to seem correct." "Brenda, this wasn't chance," I insisted, my voice rising. "He predicted a mechanical failure to the minute. He knew about Maria's private phone call." Dr. Evans cleared his throat. "Sarah, from a clinical perspective," he began, his tone gentle but firm, "what you're describing are a series of compelling coincidences filtered through the lens of a high-stress environment. The information about your review? He could have overheard staff gossip. The comment to Maria? A lucky guess. Many young people have arguments with their parents about money. And the 4-clamp? He picked up the bag with the clamp inside. This is a piece of mass-produced medical equipment. It was probably old. It was bound to fail eventually. The fact that he mentioned it was, again, a coincidence. His mind is likely fixated on his immediate environment. The 4-stand is a part of that. It's a classic example of confirmation bias. You were primed by his strange comment, so when the event occurred, you assigned it a significance it doesn't objectively have. I felt a wave of frustration and helplessness. They were taking every piece of my experience, every deeply unsettling event, and neatly filing it away into a sterile box labeled coincidence or symptom. They were pathologizing my reality. This was institutional betrayal in its purest form. They weren't protecting the patient or seeking the truth. They were protecting the system, protecting the comfortable, rational world they understood. They were telling me that I, not the situation, was the problem. So what you're saying is I should just ignore it? I asked, my voice trembling with suppressed anger. You should document his statements objectively in your notes, Brenda said, her tone shifting from disappointed to authoritative. Patient stated X. Patient expressed Y. No interpretation, no emotional language, and you will maintain strict professional boundaries. He is a dying man, Sarah. Our job is to provide comfort care, not to analyze his delusions. Are we clear? The message was unmistakable. I was being warned. My credibility was on the line. I was alone in this. I walked out of that office feeling a profound sense of moral isolation. They had given me a direct order to ignore the evidence of my own senses, to treat the impossible as mundane. I now had a choice. I could fall in line, protect my career, and just do my job. Or I could keep digging, keep listening to Alistair Finch, and try to understand what was really happening in room 8, even if it cost me everything. As I walked back onto the floor, I knew with a sinking feeling that I had already made my choice. I had to know the truth. My protective instinct wasn't just for Mr. Finch anymore. It was for the truth itself, a truth my own institution was determined to bury. The stakes had just been raised. This was no longer just about a strange patient. It was about my own sanity and the integrity of my entire professional life. The days that followed my meeting with Brenda and Dr. Evans settled into a tense, surreal routine. I followed their orders, at least on paper. My nursing notes for Alistair Finch became models of clinical detachment. 1:15 patient resting quietly with eyes open, vitals stable. 3:40 patient declined offer of water. Stated he was calibrating internal fluid balance. I wrote down his words verbatim without comment, just as I was told. But each entry felt like a lie of omission, a sterile description of a phenomenon that was anything but. In reality, my investigation had simply gone underground. I became a secret chronicler, keeping a second set of notes in a small, private journal I kept in my locker. My interactions with Alistair took on a new quality. The fear I had initially felt was slowly being replaced by a kind of awestruck, terrified curiosity. I was no longer just his nurse. I was his student, his sole audience. He, in turn, seemed to understand the change in me, the shift from professional skepticism to a quiet, desperate need to understand. He never spoke of his abilities, as I had started to think of them in a boastful way. He delivered his impossible observations with the same flat effect as someone commenting on the weather. One night, about a week into his stay, I was adjusting his pillows. The television in the corner was on, tuned to a 24-hour news channel, the volume muted. A story came on about a complex stock market fluctuation, a sudden, unexpected dip in the tech sector. Alistair's eyes flickered to the screen. An algorithmic trading error, he said, his voice a low murmur. A single misplaced decimal in a recursive function at the firm of Sterling Ashburton. It will be corrected in 47 minutes. The market will rebound, but a junior programmer named David Chun will be fired. It is an inefficient and punitive system. I just stared at him. The next morning, I checked the financial news on my phone before my shift. The headline spoke of a flash crash the previous day, which had mysteriously corrected itself within the hour. Later that week, I spent 2 hours on a deep dive into financial forums until I found it. A small, unconfirmed rumor about a junior programmer at Sterling Ashburton being escorted from the building. Coincidence? My rational mind screamed that it had to be, but my gut, the part of me that had learned to trust intuition over 18 years of nursing, knew it wasn't. The resistance from my colleagues grew. Brenda watched me like a hawk, often standing silently at the nurse's station, her eyes following me as I went into room 8. She started double-checking my charting, looking for any hint of the emotional interpretation she had warned me against. Maria, my only potential ally, grew distant. After what he'd said to her, she was now terrified of Mr. Finch. She would only enter his room if I was with her, and she refused to make eye contact with him, performing her duties with a rushed, fearful efficiency. I was an island. The moral isolation was complete and suffocating. I was the only one who saw the lightning, and everyone else was insisting it was just a trick of the light. The failure of rational explanations became a daily torment. I spent my off hours in the medical library at St. Jude's, poring over neurology textbooks. I read about frontotemporal dementia, about savant syndrome, about every conceivable condition that could explain his abilities. Nothing fit. Savants had incredible abilities in one specific area like math or music, but they didn't have this broad-spectrum omniscience. Neurological disorders could cause strange utterances, but they didn't predict mechanical failures to the minute or diagnose algorithmic trading errors. Every rational door I tried to open was locked. My personal investment deepened. It was no longer just about the mystery. I felt a profound, almost sacred duty to this man. The world saw him as a medical curiosity, a collection of dying cells and misfiring neurons. His doctors, his power of attorney, my own supervisors, they had all written him off as a tragic but explainable case. I was the only person who was truly listening, the only one who was bearing witness to what he actually was. And what was that? I still had no idea. Was he a prophet? An alien? A being from another dimension experiencing life in a human shell? The questions were insane, the kind of thoughts that, if spoken aloud, would get me a psychiatric evaluation. But in the quiet of room 8, in the presence of that calm, all-seeing gaze, they felt less like madness and more like the only logical possibilities left. The conflict with the institution was heading for a breaking point. About 2 weeks into his stay, Brenda called me into her office again. Dr. Evans was there, too. On her desk was my private journal. My heart plummeted into my stomach. She must have gone into my locker. "We need to talk about this, Sarah," Brenda said, her voice dangerously quiet. She tapped the cover of the journal. Algorithmic trading errors? Predictions about the staff's personal lives? Notes on transtemporal awareness? This is not nursing. This is an obsession. You are unwell. You are a liability to this facility and to your patient. You went through my personal locker? I was stunned, the violation of it momentarily eclipsing my fear. I had reason to believe you were not following my directive and were engaging in unprofessional conduct. I was right, she snapped. Dr. Evans and I have discussed it. We're putting you on a mandatory leave of absence, effective immediately. You need to get help, Sarah. You're burning out and it's manifesting in this fantasy. It's not a fantasy, I pleaded, looking at Dr. Evans. He's doing these things. You're not in there, you don't see it. All you see is a chart. I see a man who defies every law of science we know. Dr. Evans sighed, his expression a mixture of pity and professional concern. Sarah, your empathy has always been your greatest strength, but it is also your greatest vulnerability. You've formed a folie à deux, a shared psychosis with a delusional patient. It's a known phenomenon. You need distance. For your own health. They weren't listening. They couldn't listen. To acknowledge what I was saying would be to acknowledge that their entire worldview, the bedrock of their medical and scientific training, was flawed. It was easier, safer to diagnose me. The institutional betrayal was now complete. They weren't just ignoring the truth. They were actively punishing me for seeing it. You can't do this, I said, my voice shaking. His condition is deteriorating. The neurologist said he has less than a month. He doesn't have time for me to take a leave of absence. He needs someone there who understands. He needs a professional nurse who can provide objective comfort care, Brenda said coldly. Which, at this moment, you are not. Your leave starts now. Go home, Sarah. We'll call you in a few weeks to discuss your future here. I walked out of her office in a daze. I had been summarily dismissed, My 18 years of service erased by a few weeks of impossible truth. My career, my reputation, it was all crumbling. I gathered my things from my locker, leaving the confiscated journal on Brenda's desk. It was useless now. As I walked towards the exit, passing the nurse's station, I made a decision. I wasn't going home. Couldn't. This was bigger than my job. I felt a fierce, protective instinct, not just for Alistair, but for the moment of his death. I could not let him die surrounded by people who saw him as a broken machine. I had to be there. I was the only one who could be. I waited in my car in the far corner of the parking lot. I watched the shifts change. I watched the sun go down. I knew his decline was accelerating. The physical shutdown would be rapid. It might even be tonight. Around 10 p.m., I slipped back into the building through a side entrance used for laundry services. An entrance I knew was rarely monitored at night. I moved through the familiar hallways like a ghost, my heart pounding. I was trespassing in the place I had called a second home for nearly 2 decades. I made my way to the small, unused family consultation room across the hall from room 8. From there, I could watch his door. I would wait. I didn't know what I was waiting for, but I knew I had to be there when it happened. I was risking my entire career, my nursing license, everything I had worked for. But in that moment, none of it mattered as much as being the last person to see Alistair Finch alive. I had to hear his final words. The hours ticked by in agonizing slowness. I sat in the dark consultation room, a fugitive in my own workplace. The quiet of the hospice night, once a comfort, now felt charged with tension. Every soft footstep in the hall made me jump. I watched the night nurse, a younger agency nurse I didn't know well, do her rounds. I saw her go into Alistair's room at 11 p.m. and again at 1 a.m. Each time she emerged, she just made a note on the chart and moved on, oblivious. To her, he was just another patient, a name on a list, a body in a bed. Around 3 a.m., I saw Dr. Evans arrive. That was unusual. The medical director rarely came in during the night unless it was a true emergency. He went into room 8 and stayed for nearly 20 minutes. When he came out, his face was grim. He spoke briefly with the agency nurse, who then made a phone call. I knew what was happening. Alistair was actively dying. The final, irreversible cascade had begun. This was it. The end was near. After Dr. Evans left, a profound stillness settled over the wing. The agency nurse got busy with another patient at the far end of the hall. This was my chance. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, but my purpose was clear. I slipped out of the consultation room and crossed the hall, pushing open the door to room 8 as quietly as I could. The only light came from the medical monitors beside his bed, casting a pale, greenish glow on his face. His breathing was very different now. It had the classic Shane Stokes pattern, a cycle of shallow breaths that grew deeper and more rapid, then faded away into a terrifying period of apnea, a silence where I counted the seconds until the next breath began. This was the signature rhythm of the end. His eyes were closed. For a moment, I thought he was unconscious, that I was too late. I moved closer to the bed, my hand hovering over his, wanting to offer that final, human comfort. Then his eyes opened. They weren't hazy or unfocused, as you'd expect from a dying man. They were sharper, brighter, more intensely alive than I had ever seen them. They fixed on me with an unnerving clarity. All the air seemed to leave the room. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp, but the words were perfectly formed. "I knew you would come. The protocol required your dismissal, but the outcome required your presence." A necessary paradox. I couldn't speak. I just stood there, my entire being focused on him. "The hardware is experiencing catastrophic, cascading failure," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. He was narrating his own death with the detached precision of a systems engineer reporting a server crash. "Primary motor cortex, offline. Brainstem functions, intermittent. Pulmonary and cardiac systems are decoupling from central control. It's an inefficient design. Messy. So much biological noise." He took a rattling breath. "But the data transfer is almost complete. Data transfer? I finally managed to whisper, the words feeling absurd on my tongue. What do you mean? His eyes seemed to look right through me, into me. Consciousness is not a product of the hardware, Sarah. It is the operator. The body is just a temporary vessel, a biological interface. And this one is expiring. Another long pause in his breathing. I thought he was gone. But then his chest hitched with another breath. The next vessel is unexpected, primitive but with potential. The connection is already established. This was it. The moment I had sacrificed everything for. The climax of this impossible story. I leaned closer, my ear just inches from his lips, determined not to miss a single word. Don't worry, he rasped, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips for the first time. It was a terrifying sight. It's not a transfer you would understand. Not yet. But you will be part of the initial observation period. You're essential. Why? I breathed. Why me? His eyes held mine. Because of the little girl. The one you will have. The one you don't yet know you are carrying. My entire world tilted on its axis. I wasn't pregnant. Couldn't be. My husband and I had been told years ago, after rounds of heartbreaking tests and failed treatments, that it was a biological impossibility. We had made our peace with it. It was a closed chapter of our lives, a deep and private grief. Her name will be Alara, Alistair whispered, his voice now barely audible, a thread of sound in the silent room. She will have your husband's hair, but she will have my eyes. Remember that. When you look into her eyes, you will see. The signal is clear. And then his final words. They weren't for me. He looked past me, up at the corner of the ceiling, as if reporting to someone I couldn't see. Finch, Alistair. Interface 7 Gamma 4. Decommissioning complete. Data migration successful. Stand by for new vessel activation. As the last word, activation, left his lips, his own eyes went blank. The light, the intelligence, the unnerving presence. It vanished in an instant. It was like a switch had been flipped. His head lolled to the side. The man I knew as Alistair Finch was gone. At that exact moment, the cardiac monitor beside the bed, which had been showing his slow, erratic heartbeat, flatlined. It let out a single, long, piercing tone. Asystole, the sound of death. But something else happened in that same instant. Something that defied every law of physics. As the tone from the heart monitor began, every other piece of electronic equipment in the room flickered in unison. The digital clock, the 4-pump display, the small, muted television screen, they all went dark for a split second and then flashed back on. And on the screen of the heart monitor, for less than a second, over the flat green line of asystole, a single word appeared in blocky, digital letters. Migration. Then it was gone, replaced by the standard, signal lost message. I stood there, frozen, the single tone of the monitor drilling into my ears. I stared at the blank screen where the word had been, my mind utterly shattered. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't a stress-induced fantasy. It was real. I had seen it. It was the final, irrefutable piece of evidence. The truth, in all its terrifying, incomprehensible glory, was that Alistair Finch hadn't just died. He had relocated. The sound of the monitor finally broke my paralysis and alerted the agency nurse, who came running into the room. She saw me, her eyes wide with shock and accusation. "What are you doing here? You're on leave," she stammered, before her training took over and she rushed to the bed to confirm the death. I didn't say a word. I just backed out of the room, turned, and walked away. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The agency nurse reported me, of course. I was officially fired the next day for gross misconduct, trespassing, and violating a direct order. My nursing license was placed under review. Brenda and Dr. Evans filed a report detailing their concerns about my mental stability, effectively blacklisting me from any other reputable medical facility in the state. My 18-year career was over, ending in disgrace and scandal. My colleagues, the people I had worked with for years, wouldn't meet my eye. I was the crazy nurse who had a psychotic break, the cautionary tale they would tell for years to come. I didn't fight it. What could I say? Who would believe me? The truth was so far beyond the realm of their experience that it would only confirm their diagnosis of me. So I accepted the professional consequences. I surrendered my career, my reputation, my identity. It was the price of what I had seen. The personal cost was immense. I had lost everything that had defined me. But the story doesn't end there. 2 weeks after I was fired, after the worst and most confusing period of my life, I was feeling constantly exhausted and nauseous. I chalked it up to stress. My husband, bless his heart, convinced me to see a doctor. I thought it was pointless, but I went. And the doctor, after running some tests, came back into the examination room with a look of utter bewilderment on her face. She told me something that, according to all my previous medical records, was a 1 in a million impossibility. I was pregnant. 9 months later, I gave birth to a healthy, beautiful baby girl. My husband and I were in a state of joyful disbelief. It was a miracle we had long since stopped praying for. She had her father's wavy brown hair. She was perfect. We brought her home, and a few days later, as I was holding her in the quiet light of the nursery, she opened her eyes and looked up at me, and I stopped breathing. They were not my blue eyes. They were not my husband's hazel eyes. They were a clear, startlingly bright, intelligent gray. The same gray as the man who died in room 8. And as I looked into my infant daughter's eyes, I felt it. A flicker of recognition. A sense of a vast, ancient, and utterly alien consciousness looking back at me. Calm, placid observation. I never told anyone the full story. Not my husband, not my therapist, not my closest friends. How could I? But I live with it every day. I left nursing and I never looked back. The world of medicine, of science, of predictable outcomes no longer makes sense to me. My worldview wasn't just impacted. It was obliterated. I now live in a world where I know, with absolute certainty, that death is not an ending. It is a transfer, a migration, and that we are surrounded by things we cannot begin to comprehend. My daughter's name is Alara. She is a happy, brilliant, and wonderful child. But sometimes, when the house is quiet, she will look at me with those impossibly old eyes, and I see a flicker of that same detached, analytical calm I saw in Alistair Finch. And I remember his final words. When you look into her eyes, you will see. The signal is clear. The case of Alistair Finch was never solved. The mystery only deepened. It cost me my career, my reputation, and my understanding of reality. But in the end, it also gave me the one thing I thought I could never have. And it left me with a terrifying, sacred, and ongoing truth. I was the last person to see that patient alive, but I see him still, every single day.